Testing, testing. Hello, hello. Welcome back, everybody. Hope you enjoyed that little break. Thank you for getting back here on time. Such a respectful group. I love that. And just a reminder again about cell phones and just making sure those doors close softly behind you if you do have to leave, but I don't think you're going to want to leave with our next speaker, that's for sure. Also, I noticed a lot of you did quickly run in the vendor's room. Definitely make time to go in there if you haven't already. There's so many wonderful things in there. And just a reminder that there is a free movie festival happening today and tomorrow. That's from 9:30 a.m. to 5 in the Andalusia room. So it is time now for our second speaker of the day. He's had over a half a century of service in national security, including combat as a Green Beret commander in Vietnam. So you better be sure I was going to start on time for him. He held key assignments in special operations, intelligence, and research and development, and participated in several unique programs, including application of psychokinesis, enhancing human performance with NLP, or neuro-linguistic programming, and experimentation with a unique energy source known as the Hutchinson effect. He formed an interagency group to study UFOs called Advanced Theoretical Physics, and he's a former past president of the International Association for Near-Death Studies. He was a founding board member of the International Remote Viewing Association as well. He has published 5 nonfiction books, including Future War, UFOs, Myths, Conspiracies, and Realities, and most recently, Reality Denied, First-Hand Experiences with Things That Can't Happen But Did. Please welcome John Alexander.
Thank you. Great talk by George. I was listening to it. Now, what I'm hoping is that you heard what he said, not what you think he said. That's, I could see a lot of room for extrapolation there. And your clicker is, oh, there we go. I want to start, I know there's a lot of mythology out there, but I want to start with explanation of or a position statement on what my position on various things are. It says, by definition, UFOs must exist. That just means there's something out there that's flying around that you can't identify. So that doesn't mean what they are. I think that the evidence supporting the physical existence of UFOs is simply overwhelming, and those people who have claimed there is no evidence just have never looked at the evidence. My personal interest starts back in 1947. Had 2 minor sightings. I may get to one of those. Everybody's biased. I'd like to acknowledge mine. First of all, as the intro said, I've been involved in studies in many, many areas. And in my view, all of these things are interrelated, and that does include UFOs, and even the issues on cryptozoology. And the common issue on there is consciousness. Give a lot of presentations and to various groups. One of them, you can see the UFOs, the other near-death studies group. They've dealt with shamans all over the world, and given at the Amazonian Shamans Conference a number of times, and remote viewing. And what's amazing to me in many of these areas is how stovepipe things have become and how they don't recognize the interrelationships between these phenomena. Complexity. This is a terribly, terribly complex topic. And that does not bode well for the government being involved. They don't like to deal with things where you can't explain or understand them. One of the problems we have as a reality is that everybody's becoming proportionally more ignorant. That's not a bad thing. The point here is, if you look at the graph, there is the advent of information. And we're now at a point where they say the total information available to the world is doubling about every 12 hours. That's why you see an exponential rise. Now, to this topic, UFOs. I'm not sure what you mean. Because I've heard everybody talking about, we want to have advanced technology and that. But I got little balls of light, orbs and whatnot. We've got huge craft, literally miles across, that are quite physical, and everything in between. And it's the problem that I see is there are so many different kinds of things. So when you get into the issue of, do they exist or what does it mean? It's you got to get back to, what type of UFOs are you talking about? This is the problem. Now, the question is not, is there life someplace else in the galaxy? The answer to that is yes, and that doesn't matter a belief system. That's pure math. You look at there, it says 100 billion planets that could support life in our universe, and the total universe out there, 19 sextillion. What does that mean? I think it's 35 or 37 zeros after it. So the probability of life, even if you're a pure materialist, the probability of life evolving is almost 100%. Now finally, the spectrum of beliefs, and this is kind of important. You got debunkers, of course, and skeptics. Now the problem, of course, is most of the skeptics are really debunkers. It can't be, therefore it isn't. Then you have UFOs exist, and we get, of course, into crashes, or is an alien re-engineered vehicle they've invented on it. And finally, aliens are among us. Now, what's interesting, Roper did a global poll, and they found that 20% of the population, this is of the world now, believes that ET is here walking among us, and maybe some of you out there, can't tell. But the key thing is the Pentagon says. First of all, the Pentagon says nothing. It's a big stone building, and it's filled with about 29,000 people that work there. And the people say things, and they have a wide variety of different views, and they don't always agree. Now, there's good news and bad news. Good news is the government doesn't know what the government knows. And I think George talked to some of that. You have these little pockets of information in there. The bad news is, for the most part, in this topic, they really don't care. Now, here's the paradox. I think most people think the government's totally incompetent and can't do anything, except in one field, and that's if it's UFOs, then they suddenly become omniscient. Doubt that. Now, how do these programs get started? I'm going to talk about one that I ran, started in about 82, and ran for a number of years. But in general, what happens is they start, and George was alluding to this now, small groups of people, personal interest in trying to do it. Never have we seen one that's driven from the top down, where they, the hierarchy has said, we've got to do this. You do get some support, and you do have inquiries. And I said, I'm going to talk about my program. You talked about ATEP with Lou Elizondo. My guess, there may be more programs like that out there. These, as George was talking about, little pockets of people who are interested and decide to do something about it. Critical issue, and one that's been, there is a huge difference between personal interest and institutional responsibility. It says there's about 4 million government workers, and what that tells you is we estimate that based on 12% of the population, the Gallup poll, that means about 480,000 people in the government have seen something that they believe is a UFO. That does not translate to, therefore, their organization has institutional responsibility for that. Now, this is when I looked up, I was surprised, but 962 what we call flag officers, that would be admirals and generals, in the DOD at any given time. Took an estimate since the end of Blue Book, maybe 1968. There must have been about 6,500 flag officers. If I extrapolate and I say maybe 10% are like the others and have had their own sighting, that would mean there's 650 senior officers, flag grade officers, who have had observations. So my question is not, why do these programs exist? It is, why don't we have more? Where is the personal interest? And again, the translation between individual interest and institutional responsibility. Okay, what I ran a number of years ago, it's about 82, 83 time frame. We called it the Advanced Theoretical Physics Group, and I did that intentionally so that folks like you, FOIA had just really hit the spot. When we figured nobody's going to ask about, information about the Advanced Theoretical Physics Group. So it was kind of FOIA protection. The participants were from all of the service, from the intelligence community, all of them were involved, and aerospace industry who were involved. All of them had not only top secret, but SCI level clearances, we hear the special clearances. It was literally an old boy net, and meaning there were no females involved. And they were all knowledgeable on the topic. And now one of the key issues that was violated, as it turns out, was there were not supposed to be any written records kept. And also from a funding perspective, everybody had to cover their own expenses. We did not have any funding. Now what we did find out quite early on is everybody thought somebody else was doing it. They say nobody's minding the store. All of the agencies were involved said, you mean you're not doing it? And they all knew the background and the key stories. We'll hit some of them in a minute. So the original outline, we'll talk about the background, the history, and I'm going to do part on the basic briefing that we had drawn up, the military significance, the cases with physical significance, and the point is it's not going away. The key issue here is the timing and what we knew and when we knew it. This was our suspicion going in. Roswell was real. They had picked up a widget of some kind, carted it off someplace, looked at it, said, no way in hell we're going to figure out whatever this is. We'll put it away. And this is from Raiders of the Lost Ark, of course, a place like Suitland, where they park and say, we'll bring it out in half a century and look again and see if we can do any better. Again, not what we found. The purpose, now the white part of these slides are actually taken from view graphs that I use. I'm going to go through them fairly quickly because it was fairly lengthy. Like many others said, at this time, if you remember, we're talking Star Wars, SDI, the Strategic Defense Initiative, was the biggest program out there. That's why I say the three SDI threat implications, that we were worried about, we're monitoring things, and we don't want to touch off a war because you see something zipping around and mistake it for Soviet. I'm going to say Soviet, remember, this is the bad old days. Soviet Union still exists. Potential for cover and deception. There's a leap in technology. Remember, this is in the 20th century, and so we were saying, if we can understand these things, we can make a huge leap in technology. And like George said, and you saw in Hal's briefing, that it would be unacceptable for somebody else to make a breakthrough that we didn't. This is very similar to the conclusions that the ATEP program came up with. So it can't tell whether there's real or not, and that doesn't matter. We need to be able to tell the difference. Condon report, or the Colorado report, really significant in that the question to Condon was not, are UFOs real or do they exist? The question was, is it a threat? And this is where I say Condon was right. basically haven't been invaded, at least as far as we know. So no credible threat has been. Now, Condon didn't actually get involved in the study, and unfortunately, actually part of the study is pretty good. If you read the body of the text, the problem is in the conclusion, the recommendations. Condon himself wrote those, yet was not involved in the study. But in the body, you find some pretty good cases that are in there. Unfortunately, the scientific community, when you talk to them, believed this was a be-all, end-all, a serious study. It was really, I think, started around $250,000. Frankly, they couldn't get anybody to take the case. They had offered it up to various institutions. Nobody wanted to touch it. University of Colorado did. But if you know anything about government studies, we're in, not even lunch money. But the Air Force got what they wanted. This was a good way to make it just go away. Now again, early 1980s, we're saying, what have we seen? Rapid acceleration, high G turns, stealth technology, things appearing and disappearing, and disruption of electrical. Eyewitness reports. There already were lots and lots of high credibility reports, including astronauts and military reports. And you have multiple witnesses from, it's not just one guy who's out there seeing something, it's up to thousands. And sometimes the duration lasted, some of the instant sightings from a few seconds to hours, and recurrence from days to years, and close proximity in many cases. Physical evidence, lots of physical evidence involved. And these have, this was an interesting case that had come up in 1957, RB-47. This is one of our first ELINT birds, electronic surveillance kind of craft. And the point here is it was flying out. You can see the track that it went there. We had it for 90 minutes. It's on the track, and you're having not only confirmation from the air, but several ground control radars reporting on it. So no doubt about the physical existence of it. It was studied extensively at that time. The thing that was unique about this, since it was an ELINT bird, is that they actually picked up a signal from there. It was around, I recall, 3 gigahertz. Now, do satellites see them? The answer is yes. And this is one of the examples. This is a DSP satellite. Again, this one's 1984. What we have now, this is a satellite that's sitting out in geosynchronous orbit, meaning it's way out there and the area is really cold. And what happened is that you see the little black line that's coming across there, there's something flew in front of that sensor that's quite warm because it's a thermal sensor, and it's picking things up. Did they look at it? You bet. They came up with, have no idea what this is. This is an interesting one, also thermal sensors. That's what you see is that big dot there is Point Barrow, Alaska, a very, very cold regime, and you can confer it with SeaTac Airport. So you, again, very, very hot things being seen where they just shouldn't be. Was visiting NORAD headquarters, and I thought I'd be a smart ass. And so I asked the question, it says, would you ever get things that come in and accelerate quickly or make high G turn, these rapid turns? And the guy, briefer, looked at me and said, you mean UFOs? Yes. And then cut the conversation off at that point. If you're familiar with the Cash Landrum case, I actually got a bit involved in this from an official perspective. I had been an inspector general in the Army, and what happened was, you may know the case, 2 women and a boy exposed to radiation. They ended up suing the United States Air Force initially. And of course, if you remember the case, there was a number of helicopters that are supposedly circling, 22, 23 helicopters, and including Chinooks. Air Force said, they can't be our helicopters, Army, you got it. And a friend of mine happened to get stuck with the case. Actually did quite an extensive bit of research on it. Now, reality is this case is serious. And if you'll remember, Cody, little boy, jumped out and ran around in front of the car can't land, I forget which one's which. But one stepped out, she's standing behind the door. The other one went out in front. That's Betty Cash, who ended up dying from leukemia about 20 years later. They were subjected to severe radiation. And there's just no doubt about that, alopecia. But what's consistent is in the story, the amount of radiation they receive is directly correlated with the way that they had recorded it. Eventually got thrown out of court, by the way, that said it's not the government responsibility. But they did look at it very quick, a lot. This was a case that we had, again, 1986. This is a JAL flight. The problem, you have multiple witnesses. You have the radar contact from them. They talk about the other system. If you know what Cobra Dane was, that's probably Cobra Dane at that time. But this pilot is talking about something, the two objects that came up, and one of them, larger than 2 aircraft carriers, huge. Sighting went on for 50 minutes. Now, you might, if you remember or followed the case, the pilot came forward and mentioned that, and for his effort, he was fired by JAL for embarrassing the company. There was a number of sightings that we encountered. I got these quite accidentally, and almost nobody knows about them. But it points to what happens with the information. Again, because of the Inspector General's office, friends of mine were up inspecting the Alaska National Guard and found these literally sitting in a drawer. And they said, the guy said, I don't know, we've been getting these reports from the Alaskan Scouts. Almost nobody's heard of the Alaskan Scouts. Again, this is the bad old days. We were always having physical incursions on the ground by the Soviets. People don't follow that stuff. So the Alaskan National Guards basically were First Nation people who were literally seal hunters, and you gave them a radio and binoculars, and they would go out and report these things. And again, they came in and reported but didn't go anyplace. What was of interest to me is these are people whose life depends on understanding the environment. So when you get things like this is one where they describe the UFO up to going into a cloud and moving against the wind. A number of those cases that were, again, not well known, reported, but there's no place to go in the system. Many of you will remember Gulf Breeze with Mr. Ed. This started in 1986 and lasted for a number of years. But the point is that people were blasting Ed Walters as making this story up. There was more than 100 witnesses that were reporting it. It got so common, and Bruce Maccabee talks about this and went down there, that people changed their lifestyle. These were occurring up frequently enough that they would go out and meet on the beach and watch for UFOs. They say lots of sightings, lots of photos that went out. It says, I was one of the men in black, and the side story, but I was traveling with a team from the Lockheed Skunk Works. I was at Los Alamos by this time. That this part of the story occurred. We were going to give briefings at Special Operations Command headquarters down in Tampa and come back up to FSOC, which was at Hurlburt Field. And the timing was such that we were going to give the briefing one day in MacDill in Tampa, fly up. Since I was planning the trip, I said, okay, well, what I'm going to do, we're going to stay overnight, so I'm going to stay near Gulf Breeze and go there. Well, as it turns out, what happened is that late afternoon, rain's heavy, and thunderstorms come in, so our flight gets delayed and delayed and delayed. So finally we get in, but instead of arriving early and going to the hotel and dropping them off, we're all together and we're still, coat and tie, ready from doing the formal briefing. Turns out we had a rental car, and they gave me a really dark green rental car. It looked like black, and so we all showed up, and we were literally the men in black there. But a very interesting case that did go on. The story there, by the way, was that when it first came out, the editor, the Gulf Breeze Sentinel, which is now non-existent, the editor was looking, he had received a number of pictures from the Ed Walters pictures that you may have seen, and he's looking at it and wondering, what the hell do I do with this? He said his parents came in and saw the pictures and said, what are these? He said, well, some crazy UFO pictures. And so, yes, but that's like the ones we saw. And that's when he said, oh, if I can't believe my parents, who can I believe? The Iranian case is really one of the significant ones. This was over Tehran. As many of you know, General Girani has come forward, but you had multiple radars. It was visual sightings, sent out the F-16s. Now, one of the things that's interesting about this is as the fighters went in, their communication was set off. And what was interesting, one is that he decided to fire an AIM-9 missile. And when he did, all of the electronics in the plane was cut off. No, why that's of interest, my last assignment was as Director of Advanced Systems Concepts, what was there, the Laboratory Command. Had all of the tactical directed energy programs that the Army was working on at the time. My point is here, I know how to turn you off, don't know how to turn you back on again. Yet that's what happened here. As you went in, you got turned off. As they came out, it came back up again. Oh, I was mentioning, because I was watching John Greenwald, I guess it was, in the recent program. I said, well, this was highly classified. The thing that was classified about this, by the way, remember, this is, again, bad old days. Shaw's still in power at the time. The thing that was sensitive is that we were monitoring our allies as opposed to anything about the UFOs itself. Another case that came up was over Brazil. Colonel Silva, who was a retired Brazilian pilot, flying along, and he gets surrounded by UFOs. They sent up Mirages, they sent up F-5s and whatnot, and chased. This was a duration of over 3 hours. Now, I think the thing that's most significant about this, unlike many cases, is the next day, the Air Minister went public and said, yea, verily, this event did happen. This you're going to hear a lot about. Bob Salas is talking about it. I think is one of the most significant cases, certainly, but we were well aware of this at the time. Since he's talking on it, I won't go into it. You should know about it. But the point was, a whole lot of missiles went down, and in the nuclear triad, this had a strategic implications. Normally, you would have one missile, or for the squadron, 2 missiles per year might go down, but they had 16 to 18 down simultaneously. Really, really significant. We were not alone. The Soviets had a case, and the reason the thing is missing, like I say, I'm literally, copying these slides. But this is one, and the huge difference there is the UFO comes in, hovers over their missile base. Now, if you remember, in ours, the missiles went down. In their case, the thing is hovering there, and the missiles started spinning up. And the lieutenant colonel was trying to, my God, we're about to start World War III, and I can't stop it. It ended up being, just shutting down on its own. But again, hundreds of witnesses, because the thing was just hovering there. they like we did a very intensive study. Colonel Sokoloff went in and they just disassembled. George, by the way, George Knapp gets a lot of credit because he was the one who was able to get this information and come back out. We had tried to help Sokoloff, but the difference in the system and why it might have responded differently is that ours were shut down. We had a decentralized system, meaning that the launch control officers, we trusted them out at the site. They had to wait for authentication and all that. Soviets did not trust theirs, so they had a centralized system. Theoretically, this could not have happened without Moscow creating it. Didn't. We know about Bentwaters. I'm not going to go into that. Chuck is going to talk to this tomorrow, and John Burroughs to people. But if I'm going to pick one case, even including the ones that are coming out now, the Navy cases and that, if I was going to take one that I think is most significant, and we have the physical evidence and the numbers to support it, it would be this one. Don't want to steal any of Colonel Halt's thunder or whatnot. But what's amazing about this is the evidence has gotten stronger over time, which is very different from what you get in many of the cases. You start watching it and they kind of fall apart. This one is very significant, many witnesses, highly credible. Again, let Chuck talk to that. There also, you may remember, and we were familiar with the flights, the sites over Belgium. It was interesting, this particular one was taken, says Major General, at the time it was Lieutenant Colonel de Brouwer, actually chased the UFO there, got it on his radar, and was able to capture it on film. It was interesting, I was on a NATO study, different topic, but ended up in Belgium, and they came aside, called me aside and said, "No, was that yours?" No, we really don't know what it was. Interestingly, obviously it did not hurt his career because he went on to become the Belgian Chief of Staff of the Air Force. But again, multiple radars, multiple sightings, very supportive there. So the problem areas that we were looking at is what we call signal-to-noise ratio. Hard to determine what it was. There were physical samples, we're certainly aware of that, but the problem was in provenance and chain of custody, couldn't tell what that was. Certainly there were high strangeness factors. By and large, one of the things we do, and I think what you're seeing continuing, is in the too tough to handle bin. There are a whole series of these things that, the government, has a responsibility in some cases to look at, but just gets beyond their reasonable capability to handle it. And of course, the lack of it was lack of funding. So here's kind of a short history. There was signed grudge. The Robertson panel, they came out and of course said there's no evidence to support the threat. And of course the Condon report, which went to Blue Book and terminated Blue Book. And then the group that I had put together. One thing I guess that's important, I told you what our assumption was going in. We also assumed there was a big black program. And what one of two things would happen. Either they would come out and beat us severely and say, sit down, shut up, go suck your thumb in the corner or something. Or, and one of the suppositions was, there were people who had the information and wanted to get it out. Neither of those happened. Now, I ended up at very high levels. I had met with the director or deputy director of all those three-letter agencies. Side story in there, because I didn't have a slide on it. I was talking to one of those, the head of one of those agencies that was retired at the time. And he said, A, we don't do that. There were no institutional requirements to study it. And this is one of the agencies that would have to be involved if you understand that. The corollary was, B, let me tell you about the ones I saw. So here's a guy who, with institutional responsibility to look at threats and all of that, who had previously had a personal sighting of things he said he knew could not be flying around, was far beyond the technology, and yet did not get his agency, either personally or because it was a poem. This is a case some of you will know, the coin case. This is a famous helicopter one. Helicopters flying back, see something flying at it. What was unique about it was that the helicopters literally grabbed, and that's showing the pilot. It was like a tractor beam, picked the helicopter up and moved it away. What was interesting, again, this is one where over time more witnesses came out, and it turns out not only had the crew seen it, but there were witnesses on the ground that were familiar with it as well. This one was unique that we saw. This is one of the few. What's unique about this is that most of the time when you're looking at the picture of the UFOs, you're looking up at them. This is one where you had a plane that's actually looking down. Now, it's interesting because the people who took the photographs, they were out on a regular mission, did not see the UFO until after it was developed. This has been studied many, many times, very significant. They looked at the shadows, based on where would the sunlight have been and all that. Really a valid case. This is almost a condemnation of Blue Book, but it is one of the sightings that showed up. They got the case number. What happened is you have a B-52 that's out on a training mission. As it's headed back, the air traffic control comes back and says, we want you to go to XYZ, the site, and they go, what are we looking for, or what it is you'll know it if you see it. And this is one where Brad Union was a pilot. They're flying, and they come over the UFO, which they described there on the ground, hundreds of feet long, 200 feet in diameter, glowing craft. And the explanation was it was a star or Venus or something like that. And you're going like, they flew over Venus? Give us a break. It was interesting because there was an object that came up on the B-52, and you look in the lower right-hand corner there, and they had the good sense to snap a picture because they saw something approaching it and went away. But it gives you, just how far their Blue Book was willing to go to make this stuff just, get out of our hair. We just don't want to deal with it. What I didn't mention is that there were, in addition to the crew, there were credible witnesses on the ground that saw it hovering, so you had many different perspectives on that craft. Of course, there's been a lot of pilot observations. This has gone on for some time. So what did we do? We were, at this point, like what George had said, we were an ad hoc group. We had self-initiated, everybody was interested, no particular funding, so we decided that we would take a step forward and actually try and make it formalized and get it funding. As I mentioned, SDI was the biggest program at the time. They were around $5 billion, which also meant, if you know anything about the funding process, the knives were out because this was a target to go after money. But a meeting was set up. It was interesting because General Abramson did not know the purpose of the meeting when we went in. And I was leading it. I had a group of people from different agencies accompanying me and all that. And so told them what we were were there to talk, and I started the briefing, and it was going, about 5 minutes in, he goes, whoa, wait a minute. Who are you guys really? We went back around the room and identified the agencies and what we were interested in, all of that. Point is that for those who might think that SDI was fighting ET or something like that, this is not on their radar. So we talked to him for fairly length of time, made the case, gave him data from various places, including some stuff that the Soviets were doing. And he was interested in that, more interested in how did we get the data. But anyway, so finally I said, well, what we would like to do is to formalize the program and get funding. And this is kind of critical. He said, look, I can't touch this. I'm doing some hairy stuff now. And, you know, the big budget people are after it and trying to explain it. He says, if I get caught doing UFO study, that's going to assume that I'm not a good steward of public funds. And I won't just lose that money, I'll lose a lot more. Now, I am interested, he said he would be interested, and he says we are soon going to be monitoring more of space than we have ever before. And if you can tell me what to look for, we can put it into the algorithms and that, which we thought was kind of critical because, like I said, you saw things that were zipping around and behaving in unnatural ways. But he graciously declined. Now, this is Dean Judd. Dean is kind of critical. I didn't meet Dean until later, but he had become the chief scientist for SDI. There were several, but for several years, Dean was the chief scientist. He later became the NIO, the National Intelligence Officer for Science and Technology. NIOs, what they do is, at this time, the DNI, the Director of National Intelligence, did not exist. Remember? So the Director of CIA was also the Director of Central Intelligence, and he had something called the NIC, the National Intelligence Council. Because if you go to the president, you can't say, well, CIA thinks this and DIA thinks that and whatnot. Somebody's got to integrate it. And from S&T perspective, that was Dean. Became very good friends. We sat on other boards together later. Really critical because Dean absolutely knew the architectures. He was, I got to admit, a true skeptic. And we spent hours and hours and hours in various discussions. He was one of the guys we brought into NIDS, by the way, in the advisory board there. But when you get down there, is this thing designed to fight ET or something is out there? You know, absolutely not. Now, there were people that I had the pleasure of interacting with. Teller was a personal friend. The upper corner there, that's actually in my house in Santa Fe. Hal Putoff was up, and it was the first time that Teller, I've got to be careful. I come from a group which assume that everybody knows who Teller was. Father of the hydrogen bomb, okay, it goes back into those areas. And we had assumed that Roswell's real and that if 5 people are involved, Teller's one of them. Because remember, he's dealing with the most energy, this was hydrogen fusion at the time, that was known to man. In fact, they created Livermore to support him. Absolutely not interested. Ben Rich, also a friend. I know we got a speaker on that. Had sponsored him. Ben had in this topic, a shopping list. He actually had a liaison guy that worked with me, but he wanted the propulsion system, wanted to understand stealth, and a few of the others. So my confidence was pretty high. I said, I talked to many people from the various agencies as well. And by the way, I always try to get them pregnant. And what I mean by that is not just ask, brief them on something. I would always ask them for something minor, but just to get their involvement and it always happened. Not a big problem area. Bill Coleman came in contact with much later. Bill's integrally involved, particularly with Blue Book. He became the public information officer. He was the guy at the Air Force level who was putting out information regarding the UFO. Now, there was Blue Book, but everything had to go through Bill. Now, in order to get the job, he was interviewed by the Secretary of the Air Force, and he went in, and knowing that Blue Book was there, he says, "But you got to understand, I am not unbiased," because he had had his own experience years before as a squadron commander, and this is one where they had flown from Greenville, picked up a plane down at Fort Lauderdale, flown up to Jacksonville, and from Jacksonville we're headed back towards Mississippi when this part of the incident happened. Bill said they're sitting there talking, some lieutenants flying the plane, although he's obviously far more senior, he's sitting there, and all of a sudden they see a UFO up above them. And they go, "Oh, what's that?" And they look up that. And all of a sudden this thing is down on the deck, and as he says, you can see a circle zipping across. He said, "I'm an old farm boy. And what I could see, it was going across plowed fields. It's so low that dust is being kicked up as it goes along." So he takes control of the plane, dives after it, hides behind the tree, jumped up. They couldn't catch it, of course, and all of a sudden, this thing's back up above them. They go in, and the interesting part was that they did file reports, and then later, when he got in a position where he could check it out, said his report's missing, so we have no idea where that went. He did go on to be with Jack Webb, but some of the stories you've heard about confiscation of material are true, and Bill was the one that said, "Yeah, I went in and did that, but it wasn't because of UFOs, it was because of other secret areas." One of them was a crash of a Have Blue, which was the forerunner to the F-117. And so when they said, another one was an A-12, I think the Holloman one was actually an A-12, early A-12, which became the SR-71. And did it land at Holloman? Did they go out and throw everything? Did they lock everybody up? Yes. But he said the choice had been they had a flame out, and they could either throw the plane away or they could get it down on a longer runway. But because of the sensitivity of the aircraft prototype, all of those things did occur, and yes, they went in and collected material. This is, of course, Lou Elizondo, and we've been able to do it. Our program versus his was 22 million, mine cost 0. And this is what I like, this is a comparison. What did we know between 82 and what did they find out? Credible witnesses, multi-sensory data, all of that's true. Unique materials, yep, we had that. Unexplained maneuvers, yep, we had that. High strangeness. Funding, we had no funding, they were very modest. Lots of personal interest. And that's very limited institutional interest, which he did get some. But one of the biggies was no central authority. In other words, nobody's directing us and correlating it. Going to talk a little bit here about some guy, I think he's in the audience. He likes to say, check his hair out. That'll tell you a little bit about how long ago that picture was actually taken near, at a pub right near Whitehall in London. Now, people think that Nick is pretty well known. He's now listed, if you look on the net, as a TV personality. But I want to introduce his father. Jeffrey Pope. There's some of his credentials. One of the big ones, of course, is that he became the director of the Royal Aircraft Establishment at Farnborough. If anybody's in aviation, you know, Farnborough is just world-renowned. I guess the closest thing in the U.S. might be Wright Pat. But these were the absolute, you know, premier folks. He's in the Royal Academy of Engineering. And when I asked, I had to confirm, maybe we can ask Nick to sing for us or not, but it turns out his father was a madrigal singer and actually involved in the Imperial College choir. Where does that come out? We go to a number of years later. I was at Los Alamos National Lab, and I was working in another area, and I get a call that says Ron Oxborough, who is the chief scientific advisor for the Ministry of Defense, wants to meet you. That's all it was said. This had come from the agency, by the way. So he wants to meet you. Okay, so he shows up, and he's got an entourage with him, and entourage leaves to go look at reactors, nuclear stuff, and he and I are one-on-one, so we had a discussion. Now, I had not been given any information about what he wanted to discuss, so I was working non-lethal weapons, so we talked about that for about an hour or so. But again, just the two of us. So he left. A couple of days later, I got a call that says, "Boy, you really blew that one." I said, "What do you mean?" He said, "Well, he wanted to talk about UFOs." I'm going like, there are only two of us in the room. You know, you could have changed the topic instantly. So what happened a couple of years later, again, it was on another NATO study, and we happened to be in London. He had retired and had become Lord Oxborough, in other words, knighted. And so I went out, and he was now the rector of Imperial College. Remember, that's where Jeff Pope was number one in his class, quite a renowned engineering school. So I went out and talked to him and said, "Oh, I understand you wanted to talk about this." "Oh, yeah, I'm really interested in that." And I said, "Well, why didn't you ask Nick Pope?" And he goes, "Nicky? Why, Nicky's father was my deputy." My point here is all the stuff Nick has said is true about what they were doing, but here you had senior leadership with specific interest in the area who didn't know that the air staff was actually working on this area. And they were in a position to get most everything. By the way, if you go to Exeter College now, there's actually a Jeffrey Pope building. By the way, he was very well known on both sides of the pond, as they put it. But what Nick told me later, he says that he'd asked his father about it. His father had said, "If we had that, it would have been in my hangar." Heard a lot about Discovery. I argue this is not this is the greatest story never told. My point here is, how many times do you have to be told yes? And I don't know what you mean by disclosure. I mean, we had three presidents. You know, Reagan chased the damn UFO. Carter had reported one. Truman had reported over UFO or over Washington area. The rest of them won't go through who all of those people are, but they're from world renown, have all been saying UFOs are real. And of course, most recently, you have Obama going on there saying, you know, the footage is real, records are there, and yeah, he also said, there's stuff I can't tell you. But the point here is, lots and lots of countries have come forward with reports of UFOs. Now, we were told that if this happened, you know, terrible things would happen. The world would collapse. You can't handle it. That's not what we've seen. This has generally been the response globally. One of the key issues that I want to point out, though, this goes back to the infamous Twining memo. And yes, it was classified 1947 when it was put out. It was before he became chairman of the Joint Chiefs. But the point here is he had said in 47, yea, verily, this is real. The phenomenon is real, it's not a vision. Now, one of the key issues to me, because remember, it's going out classified. This is very shortly after the supposed crash at Roswell. You don't see anything about the crash, and that he's talking in a classified manner to his own people, saying that you're going to have to take it. Now, the problem that I see is the UFO community will not take yes for an answer. It just, I don't know how many people have to tell you, yep, it's real. The other, where I disagree with a lot of people, is we do know that most people believe in UFOs. At least 70%, probably higher than that, and particularly now. But UFOs are real, and what I say is confirmation of what you already believe is not a change. It's not a complete paradigm shift at all. And yes, they're real. It's kind of so what? No, it doesn't change them. What Victoria likes to say is, if you have this confirmation, does that mean I have to go to work tomorrow or go to school? The answer is yes. Biggest problem that I see is that we don't understand the system. That's not unusual. No, what we need to understand is that for the general population, most people believe in UFOs. Unlike this group, they're not terribly important. Yeah, it exists, so what? For this group, you have, this is really a critical issue and a front burner item. Not true in many cases. Problem is understanding how large institutions work. And that they, first of all, their main mission is to save themselves. And they exist to serve themselves, and they are rule-based systems, and the top priorities are retaining power, the golden rule. He who has the gold makes the rules, and they are logic-based systems. And one of the things I point out, in the entire United States government, there is no Department of Good Ideas. So now that's very important, because every organization, and one of the reasons that I did the threat-based thing when I was looking for money, what ATIP did was looking for money. If you're going to have a formalized program and you want to have public funding, then you've got to do something that is related to the mission. Now, I'm going to go through this. This has been talked about very quickly. This is the report. What doesn't show up, though, is, by the way, the task force that wrote the report, 2 people, part-time, had assigned a day job. Even the task force, by the way, a permanent task force is an oxymoron, because task forces, by their very nature, are designed to create specific things. So we think it's about a GS-15, fairly high-level civilian position, but the point is, all of the people, the 2 guys actually writing it have other day jobs or other assignments. We do know that there was considerable reluctance within the report to report the data. That's a list of the various agencies. Here's a list of the key people, you know all them, but I'd like to add one other thing. With Harry Reid, Stevens. Now, Stevens actually had a UFO sighting on his own. I'm not sure what Daniel Lanois had. The one thing that got them started, not running for re-election, which is critical. Let me tell you a MUFON-related story. A friend of mine was Senator Claiborne Pell. Everybody from Rhode Island remembers him. Very, very senior. Late 1980s, I have to check the exact year, the MUFON meeting was in the Washington area. I lived in the area at the time. Pell stopped by to see it. Cost him 20 points in the polls, because it was used against him. and that it literally followed him to his grave. If you look up the Washington Post obituary for Pell, you will see him mentioned or getting dinged in his obituary for being associated with this. My point here is that this is really not a voting issue. It is a strong negative from that side. You know about these, and one of the critical issues, of course, is the 80 cases with multiple sensors. These are the findings, you know that. The key issues in the report, again, you're familiar with all of these. One of the key issues, it was not historical. George had mentioned this. This was not go back and look at UFOs into antiquity and come forward. It's a very short timeline. You're familiar with these. George used the slide, the green slide there. One of the things that he brought forth in that program that I thought was critical was, because people were saying it was just a lens flare or something like that. This is a picture that he actually got credit for bringing out. This was, again, the Soviet Union. Latvia was still part of that. But the point here is those triangular or pyramidal UFOs were seen in 1958. So when you say, you know, lens flare, unlikely. Here's what's not mentioned in the report. Some of the things, first of all, high probability that's a foreign origin, non-human origin. I asked for, it says, okay, where's the classification guide? In all classified programs, you have a guide that says this is, you know, secret, top secret, blah, blah, blah. And the response was, there is no classification guide. Very controversial. Well, the other was transmedium observations. In other words, things coming out of the sea, going into the sea, and high speed in the sea. I was also struck that DOE, where the national labs where I work, was not involved, and yet they're the folks with nuclear weapons. And one of the things that does bug me is the skeptics that we've seen. Mick West is, I don't know how many times I've seen him, and Neil deGrasse Tyson on there, and they're going, I wish there were better video, and you know, we see these grainy green videos and all that. Sorry, the videos are confirmation. In other words, you've got multiple sensors getting the data. You don't want to concentrate on, you know, is what the quality of the video. And you also see, and although Hal brought this up as well, are these foreign technologies? The answer is no. And this is one, the Milt Torres case that came out a number of years ago. And this is one where you have a UFO over, this is 1957, which is kind of critical. And he's out flying, and he is directed, well, actually it was launched specifically to respond to something that they saw, again, the size of an aircraft carrier hovering over the UK. And he got forward. Now, the Mighty Mouse is about a 2.75 rocket, kind of, these are pea shooters by today's standard in rocketry and all that. But he said the guy came in and was told he was going to ripple his rockets on it, and this thing's gone. And the point is, it was registered, it went from 0 to off the radar screen, which is 250 miles in 2 seconds. That's Mach 500. And so nobody is doing these kind of accelerated things that long ago, certainly. This was interesting. The DepSecDef had put out a memo that says we're going to make this permanent, but again, I have heard that that is less than that many. You know, not a lot of folks, very small, and you do have quite a resistant group. And this is my take on it, which I guess is different from the others. The positive side is some people did take it seriously. It helped reduce the stigma, but if you think this got wiped out or internally this is seen as, okay, now we can come forward, That's just not reality. That is the side of you. The negative side, I think the secrecy is unnecessary, lack of hard data, and I think the public in general was quite disappointed. And by the way, the classified annex is only 17 pages. So when you know what we saw and you know what's not in the report and the videos that came out, just not a lot there. So, are there more UFOs? I mean, what we're hearing, and George heard the same thing. Lots and lots of more stuff that interesting that could be released. So, do you really want the government involved? What do they bring? If you look at the difference between the studies, I mentioned the overall findings between ATIP and what we did, fundamentally the same. What they did bring is sensors have improved, and you have more sensory data involved there. Again, modest funding, but with that is going to come increased security. Now, there are reasons for for security and not releasing the data. And a lot of that has to do with protecting how good the sensor systems are. It has nothing to do with UFOs necessarily, but you don't want to tell a potential adversary, what your operational parameters are, how good it is, or whatnot. So you do want to protect that, and I think it's legitimate. Now, why would you not be involved? I think that they generally see a high degree for embarrassment. I think there's a very low probability of success. But the one at the bottom is real and ran in this in the UFO program. As I said initially, you have people with a wide variety of beliefs and expectations when you get in there. And fundamentalist Christians are prevalent in many cases there. And we've had this pop up before. Yeah, it's real, but that's demonic and you should not be involved. In the interest of time, I'm going to zip through the next one. This has to do with Chris Bledsoe. Not going to go into that in any detail. This is a terribly complex case. Yeah, it happened. Yes, it's still going on. Really interesting area. You can find where we've talked, and Chris has responded in many areas as well. Going to go very quickly here into what about ET, because you don't see anything of that in the report. My take is there have been reports of humans and sentient non-humans throughout the entirety of human history in all cultures. Yeah, John Mack was a friend. We discussed this, and I will tell you his understanding is far more complex than the simple that. E.T. did it. We agree on most of the reality, but the reality of the events are real. We're not suggesting they're not real, but that is necessarily E.T. We don't. E.T. is not required. This is one of the top sellers, I guess. Sex with sentient beings has been around for a long time. You see the sleep paralysis, Christians and sentient beings, humans and celestial being interactions. You find it in Greek mythology. You find it in Roman mythology. You find it in Norse mythology. Here we have it in literature, both Rip Van Winkle, the seven sleepers of Ephesus, which happens to also appear in the Quran, so you're finding it there in Islamic cultures as well. You have sentient beings. I used to spend a lot of time in Hawaii. You know about the Menehune, the Finn folk, the Chinese mythology. Hindu mythology talks about these interactions, Buddhist mythology. And it seems like we have an awful lot of visitors, and you hear the various types that show up. One of the things that bothers me is that supposedly, they've figured out a way of physics of getting across the galaxy and arriving here, yet seem to have divided up Earth. And so we must think that Earth is on the galactic bucket list of places that you must visit if we have all of these are real. So why is it that we talk about all of these kinds of entities that UFOs are, the biggest issue that I have, particularly when you get into funding, is compared to what, and I did the title. Today is another T-Day, meaning that we are going to cross the $30 trillion mark in the national debt. So compared to what do you want to place UFOs? The problem is that funding in these areas, I have guessed and been told I'm pretty close to right, there's about $10 million per year globally in studying all of the phenomena. And yet you compare that with the Large Hadron Collider, it costs you $1 billion a year to get involved. Space research, really important. No, we talked earlier about $22 million. That doesn't cover the cost of a crew on the ISS for a single day. So look at these kind of in perspective. Hubble telescope going up. Funding for other sorts of areas. This is zero-sum game, but if you look at what's being spent in billions, and I argue that the UFOs are at least as complex as cancer. So how do you address that? And here's the problem from a government perspective, is it's a zero-sum game. There is a finite amount of money, though, we seem to be printing a lot of money recently, or funding, how we're going to cover that. But it's, if you're going to fund UFO research, it means, from a government perspective, what are you not going to fund? We spent a couple of $1 trillion, if you think this ET research, $6 trillion over the last 2 decades, and you don't see really advanced technologies evolving. None of this looks like it's ET inspired. This is what DOD thinks is the future of vertical lift. And space ventures, by the way, what George didn't go into is when Bob Bigelow Aerospace, they actually had a pod that got attached to the ISS, doing very straight world research as well. But what you don't see is any ET technology. Seems to be boys with their toys, very expensive sorts of things. We can talk, anybody wants to come out and talk Skinwalker Ranch, I will tell you, it is a very, very strange place. Because of what I saw there, I actually came up with something what I call the precognitive sentient phenomena. And by that I mean that I'm not sure what it was, but it was certainly in control. It seemed to know how we would respond to any kind of incident before it occurred. And then what would happen is, oh, you like that. If you look at it, you try to do research on it, and said, you like that? Try this. And you'd get something totally different. So you do see the trickster hasn't showed up, but again, it is in control. A bit of a blurb here. This is not the Air Force's job. In my view, we have a global phenomena that has existed throughout time. Air Force is not involved. You don't expect them to have your religion. I'll tell you where I think we need to go with this and wrapping up. If you're familiar with the Human Genome Project, I think that is the model to be approached. You have multiple governments. You have colleges and many colleges and universities, and the biggest issue is data sharing. And you've got to get the top scientists involved. Again, integrated funding in that. Unfortunately, I don't think that's what's likely to happen. The question in all of these phenomena is how much is enough before we say, yeah, it's real, we'll do something about it. My agenda personally is to try and get people who we allow the best and brightest to become involved in this without risking their livelihood or career. My pet statement is, if you're thinking globally, you're thinking too small. It's universal consciousness are interacted. The final words of my book and of this presentation is, in the end, it is clear that the universe is more complex than we ever imagined. We are not close to solving the enigmas posed by UFOs. Rather, we are still on the front end of defining the fundamental issues and boundaries. Thank you.